Well, have you ever noticed that people are unavoidable? That people are everywhere? I mean, on the bus ride to school, on the train to work, on the 401, people everywhere. And then you get to school or you get to work, and guess what? There's people there too. On your way home, all those people that were trying to get somewhere in the morning, they're trying to get somewhere at nighttime too. You maybe stop at the grocery store. You need to pick up something for your dinner preparations, and guess what? Every line is full with people. And then after all of that, you get home, and at times, guess what? There's people at your house too. See, we can't avoid people. They're everywhere. They're unavoidable. But all people aren't random. I mean, there are some strangers that we encounter each day, but others are neighbors, peers, coworkers, family members. And further, we hold specific relationships with some of these people. Culturally speaking, we understand how certain relationships are to be, whether familiar relationships or workplace dynamics. We understand how we are supposed to interact and respond to different people. Today we are looking at Ephesians 5:21 through 6:9, and I encourage you to open your Bible there as we will go through it together. In this passage, Paul outlines for us three specific relationships: that of wives and husbands, children and fathers or parents, and slaves and masters or workers and bosses. My guess is that at some point in your life, you have been one or more of these people mentioned. Now, I've had some years of experience being an employee, a worker working under the supervision of another. And I've been the son of my parents all my life, but I've only been married for 37 days. And yet, in our summer Ephesians series, I've been assigned the Wives Submit passage. Now, I can't prove it, but I have my suspicions that Pastor Jay, Pastor Rob, and Pastor Josh all arranged their vacations, their weeks that they were away, so that they could all avoid preaching on this passage. It probably went like this. Back in May, Pastor Jay called them to his office. He said, okay, this summer we're going to be preaching through the book of Ephesians. And immediately, Pastor Rob and Pastor Josh asked, which Sunday is Submission Sunday? And then there was this nervous tension in the room as they looked around and hoped that someone would be willing to offer themselves as the preacher on that Sunday. And then suddenly, Pastor Jay, his face changed, and he shared with them a brilliant idea that they immediately agreed to. We'll ask Pastor James to do it. They felt the burden lift, and they put my name down on the sheet. Okay, maybe that's not what happened. You know what, maybe they just knew that this needed a fresh perspective. I mean, they've all been married for a number of years now, but not me. I'm newly married. So all of this stuff, it's fresh for me. And you know what, I do think I'm the right person for the job. I've been married for over a month now, and I would even say that I'm so confident I can tell you what's wrong with you. I can set you straight. This morning. I can tell you what's wrong with you. But maybe you're not ready for that. Maybe you're not ready for me to tell you what's wrong with you. And I don't want to dive right into the wives' instructions. So maybe this morning we'll start at the end of our passage and work our way up to the beginning of it. Does that sound like a good avoidance scheme? Yeah, let's do that together. But before we dive in backwards, there's some things that we should understand about this passage. One, it's a household code list. See, these existed in the Greco-Roman world. They gave instruction on how houses were supposed to be run and ordered. They gave outlines of authority structures. So different versions of this kind of list existed in the day, and Paul is sending his version to the church in Ephesus. We will take note that Paul's list differs from those of the culture around him. He constantly challenges the authoritative structures that would be taken for granted by his readers. 2, Paul's letter would be sent to the church that they would read it aloud in their gatherings. Therefore, those who are addressed in this list would be present. They would be there listening to this letter and receiving this instruction. Which leads us to 3. This last relationship, the one we are starting with, is that of slaves and masters. And it can be challenging for us to read that language in the Bible and understand how Paul can speak so easily about slaves and masters without condemning it. Our mind will go to the history of slavery in North America, in the Western world. Or maybe our mind goes to racism that still exists in our day. We think of the events in Charlottesville last night. Our mind maybe even goes to modern slavery, of human trafficking, of these atrocious sins in our world. And so it's difficult for us to read passages in Scripture like this. So it's necessary for us this morning to understand that these slaves lived and worked among free people. They were part of the church community. They weren't enslaved because of racism, but because of economic dealings or family history. At times, they were very skilled. They were trained and educated, even held positions of power. And so this morning, I think it's going to be more helpful to us to read this relationship as bosses and workers rather than masters and slaves. So let's begin. Let's look at the workplace. What are bosses told to do? We start at the end of our passage, chapter 6, verse 9. And bosses, do the same things to them. Okay, the same things to them. We have to come back to that because obviously we don't know what the same things are. So bosses, do the same things to them and give up threatening. Paul would know that some people would threaten their workers in order to get the most out of them. They would threaten their lives, their safety, their well-being, maybe that of others that they loved, all to try to get the most out of them. They would abuse their workers. How do bosses threaten work today? Maybe they threaten job security, humiliation, and degrading speech. They use abusing tactics to keep you in place and try to get the most out of you. And Paul says these practices that are common for non-Christians are not to be the way you live your life. Bosses, you are to give up such behavior. You're not to do it. Now why? Why are bosses to give up threatening? So Paul continues. And bosses, do the same to them and give up threatening, knowing that both their master and yours is in heaven, and there's no partiality with him. Paul reminds them, you may think you're at top. You may think, oh, I got this place of power and authority and privilege. And guess what? You have a heavenly master yourself. You are not autonomous. You are not all-powerful. You are like those under you. You too have a master. And so while we may at times see this hierarchy between bosses and workers, God does not see any difference. He sees no partiality. So this morning, if you are a boss, if you are a supervisor, Paul is telling you, give up threatening. Give up abusing your workers because you too have a master in heaven who is not partial towards you in your place of authority over your workers. But masters are first told to do the same thing that Paul instructs the workers to do. So our question then is obviously, well, what are the workers to do? And so we look at verses 5 through 8. Workers, be obedient to those who are your bosses according to the flesh. Okay, so first they're told, be obedient to their bosses. I mean, that makes sense, right? Do what their bosses tell them to do. And Paul clarifies, their masters according to the flesh. He's saying they're earthly bosses because, again, he's going to differentiate between our earthly bosses and our heavenly master. And so Paul continues. So he says, workers, be obedient to those who are your bosses according to the flesh, with fear and trembling in sincerity of heart as to Christ. Not by way of eye service as men pleasers, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart. So this isn't simple adherence, simply doing what the boss says. No, this is quite serious. They are truly to be obedient to their earthly masters as if to Christ himself. And their motivation for this is not to please men, to please their bosses. No, it's out of service from their very hearts to Christ. Paul ends his instruction to them in verses 7 and 8. With good will render service as to the Lord and not to men, knowing that whatever good thing each one does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether slave or free. In the same house where you found slave and free people working in various positions, Paul is saying everyone will receive back what good they do. Paul is again showing us there's no distinction between these people. Human systems of authority, social standing, God does not see those. He sees all as equal. But Paul is also saying, but that doesn't mean just because God sees us all as equal and will repay you for good, doesn't mean that you should leave, that you should give up what you're doing. No, he says, work for God and not man. And remember, right after this, bosses are told to do the same thing. So bosses should also be working as to the Lord, not to please men, and to recognize that what good one does is known by God and will be repaid. So this morning, if you're a worker, if you're an employee somewhere, Paul is telling you, work hard from your heart as to the Lord. Okay, so that's our first relationship. The next relationship is children and parents. We will see that the instruction to the children counters them to both of their parents, mother and father. However, this first instruction is just given to fathers. It was a patriarchal society where the fathers understandably addressed alone. However, I believe for us this morning, again, we can understand this is for both fathers and mothers. Okay, so what is the instruction? We look at chapter 6, verses 4. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. Okay, so they're given two things. One thing that they are not to do, and one thing that they are to do. First, not to provoke children to anger. Now, I know some dads provoke their children through really bad dad jokes. Have you ever been provoked by a bad dad joke? Okay, here's an example. Why did the golfer wear 2 pairs of pants? In case he got a hole in one. Like that. That's the level, right? That can provoke you, but that's not what Paul is speaking about here. He's speaking to a culture where fathers held absolute authority and could do whatever they wanted with their children. Such an environment could provoke anger and resentment and bitterness. And Paul is saying, you are not to do that. And after telling them what not to do, he goes on to tell them what to do instead. Raise up their children in the disciplines and instructions of the Lord. So in a culture where fathers were able to do whatever they want because they had absolute authority, Paul is saying, no, you don't have absolute authority. You can't do whatever you want with your children. You're to raise them in the disciplines and the instructions of the Lord. Parents are to raise their children in the way of the Lord. It's his design, it's his purpose and plan, not the plan of the parents. So if you're a parent this morning, Paul is telling you, you are responsible for raising your kids according to God's design. All right, children, it's your turn. And I'll remind you, this letter was sent to the church and read aloud for all who are present to hear it. And so when children are mentioned here, they are there listening to this. For us this morning, it's our junior and senior highs, our young adults. that Paul is speaking to and addressing. And so he says, verses 1 through 3, "Children, obey your parents, for this is right." The same word here for the workers obeying their boss is used for children obeying their parents. Children are to do as their parents tell them. Why? For it is right. Now that sounds kind of like a parent's answer, right? When you ask your parent, that your parent tells you something and you ask, "But why?" They say, "Because I said so." It sounds kind of like that, because it's right. But no, Paul is saying, children, obey your parents because this is the right, the proper, the just thing to do. And then he goes to quote from the 10 Commandments with just one interruption to say that this is the first commandment with a promise. Paul says, "Honor your father and your mother, so that it may be well with you and that you may live long on the earth." By Paul quoting from the 10 Commandments, he's suggesting that obeying our parents is related to honoring them. And he mentions honoring, which goes even beyond simple obedience, simply doing what they say. And if you need a reason for doing this, he says, this is the first commandment with a promise. What is the promise? That you will live a good life. You will live a long life. So this morning, if you are a junior high, a senior high, a young adult, living under your parents' authority, Paul is telling you, obey and honor your parents that you may live long. Okay. So we've done pretty good. We've looked at bosses and workers. We've looked at parents and children. What do you say? Should we stop there? Should we just, sing a song, pack up, and go home early? No, we should keep going. We should keep going. And as we continue to work our way backwards through this passage, we come to Ephesians 5, verses 33. That's the next verse as we work backwards. And it's important because in this verse, Paul is summarizing what he says to wives and to husbands. So it's good for us to look at this first. Before looking at his specific instructions, we are going to look at his summary of what he says. So we read chapter 5, verses 33. "Nevertheless, each individual among you also is to love his own wife, even as himself. And the wife must see to it that she respects her husband." So Paul commands that each husband love his wife, and each wife respect her husband. Now, why didn't Paul just say, you should love and respect each other, that you should both love and respect each other? Because they both should feel love and respect. But Paul is saying something here. He is seeing something that each person needs specifically, in particular. He sees something that makes us different. Now you may have noticed that men and women can be different at times, right? There's some ways that we can be different. Here's an example of how men and women are different, how they think and respond to things are different. Here's the example. Throw pillows. Okay, I can't really make sense of throw pillows. I mean, we already have 4 regular sleeping pillows on the bed, 2 of which have to be taken off every night anyways. And now we have 2 additional pillows that are just there for decoration. We have to throw off every night and put back on the next morning. I can't make sense of it. And I'm not the only one, because I've asked some other couples that have been married for longer, and each time the husband has looked at me and said, "I still don't get it." While the wives go to Kirsten and they say, "Oh, what do they look like? Isn't it nice to see them on the bed?" Now, is either one of us wrong? No, of course not. We are just different. We think and respond to things differently. We have different needs. And so Paul says that husbands are to love their wives, and wives are to respect their husbands, because wives need love, and husbands need respect. There's a book called Love and Respect, and our library copy has already been taken out after the first service, so you can go on to Amazon or Chapters, wherever you order books, and order it by Dr. Emerson Eggerichs. And this book, Love and Respect, outlines this fundamental need and difference between married couples. How learning to understand this difference, learning to speak and give love and respect to each other, helps create stronger, more fulfilling marriages. But it's important for us to note something about this love and respect that Paul mentions. Kirsten and I, on our honeymoon, we went to Iceland. And Iceland has a lot of wind. They have so much wind that in Icelandic, there's 56 different words for wind, because each word has a different nuance and different understanding that they are talking about. Well, for the Greeks, they have different words for love. In his day, in Greco-Roman house codes, sometimes there would be an instruction for husbands to love a wife, but the word was eros, erotic love. But in this passage, Paul uses agape. And agape, we know, means unconditional love. It does not depend on what the wife does or says, but it is love freely offered up, unconditionally, by the husbands. That's the love that Paul instructs husbands to love their wives with. Okay, what about respect? Does it mean only if the husband is worthy of a respect or if he is loving? No. The language speaks again of voluntary action. So the wife and the husband are to show their spouse what the spouse needs, regardless if they are receiving what they need. So that's the summary. That's the summary of what Paul is instructing wives and husbands to do. And let's keep that summary in mind as we go into Paul's specific instructions to them. And of course, we're going to start with the instruction to husbands as we continue to work backwards. Verses 25 through 32. And before we read, notice how long this section is. 8 verses. Men are given 8 verses, where everyone else on the list is given 1 to 4 verses. So let's read from verse 25. Husbands, love your wives just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself up for her. How is a husband to love his wife? As Christ loved the church, giving himself up for her. That's a tall order. Paul then goes in and spends some time reflecting on this relationship between Christ and the church. So we keep reading in verse 26. So that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, that he might present to himself the church in all her glory, having no spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that she would be holy and blameless. Do you remember how the Bible ends? Christ comes back and returns for his bride, for the church. He has given himself for her and sanctified her and baptizes her. And in the end, he's able to present her to the Father in glory, spotless, blameless. It is the final complete restoration to how God created things to be in the beginning. And after this, Paul continues, verse 28. So husbands ought also to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his own wife loves himself. For no one ever hates his own flesh, but nourishes it and cherishes it, just as Christ also does the church. So just as husbands are called to love their wife as Christ loves the church, Paul also goes into this metaphor that they're to love their wife as their own body. He continues while quoting from Genesis. For this reason, man shall leave his father and mother and shall be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This mystery is great, but I am speaking with reference to Christ and the church. So as Paul commands husbands to love their wives as they love their own bodies, he reminds them that in the union of marriage, two are made one. And then again, he goes in to describe how that is the image of Christ and the body. That's how husbands are to love their wives. They are to nourish and cherish their wives. Why? Because they're one together. And then Paul says, well, this is a great mystery, so that's good. I have no chance of explaining it to you, so we'll keep going. No, but do you sense the impossibility of this? Each time the husband is told to love his wife, it's compared to Christ and the church. That's the standard. That's the example. That is the instruction that Paul gives. Do you see the impossibility of it? Nevertheless, husbands are to love their wives. So this morning, if you are a husband here, Paul is telling you, you need to love and cherish your wife as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. Okay. We have finally found our way through this passage to the wives. Just 3 verses given to wives. We start in verse 22. Wives, to your own husbands as to the Lord. Wives, to your own husbands as to the Lord. I feel like I'm missing something in that verse. We'll come back to it. Okay, we'll keep going. Verse 23. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ also is the head of the church, he himself being the Savior of the body. But as the church is subject to Christ, so also the wives ought to be to their husbands in everything. So here's where Paul begins this image of Christ in the church as the metaphor for husbands and wives. I am aware that these verses have caused a great deal of harm for many people through the centuries and even in recent decades. From misuse, from being handled improperly, from misinterpretation, from men putting down their wives and lording this idea of headship over them. And I think that if a man wants to hold on to that title of head of the wife, he needs to do some serious reflection on the life of Christ. See, Paul says that Christ as head is the Savior of the body. So look at Christ's life. Look at how he emptied himself. He gave up his own will and enacted the will of the Father, that he would return people to wholeness. And we have celebrated that this morning as we gathered around the Lord's table and Pastor Josh read from Philippians. Men, if your headship limits your wife, then you're doing it wrong. If your headship dismisses your wife and puts her in a lower place, you're doing it wrong. If your headship silences your wife, then you're doing it wrong. Because Christ brought people to fullness, to healing, to restoration, to life in the full. And again, we've seen through this list how Paul is saying, you have these structures of authority in your life, but with God there is none. Okay, but let's go back. Let's go back to that first verse because we need to understand what it is that wives are instructed to do. Verse 22. Wives, to your own husbands as to the Lord. What's missing here? Yeah, your Bible probably says, wives submit to, or wives be subject to. But see, the original Greek reads, wives to your own husbands as to the Lord. It's missing the verb. This is not uncommon for the New Testament writers. They would often leave out verbs in certain phrases and sentences. And a missing verb is to be understood within its context. And so to supply the verb here, we have to go back to the verse before it. Verse 21, and submitting yourselves to one another in reverence of Christ. Here is where we get the verb submit. Before Paul gives any instruction to wives, husbands, children, fathers, workers, bosses, he says this, addressing the whole church. He says each person in the church is to submit themselves to one another. So when wives are told to be subject to and submit to their husbands, they're actually being told what everyone is instructed to do to one another, specifically do that for your husband. They aren't being told anything different here. Okay, but what does this submission mean? Because this is a word that has a lot of weight. How do we understand what this word is? Okay, I'm going to get a little nerdy for you. In the Greek, it is a present passive participle. Okay, a present passive participle. That means two things for us this morning. Present participles are words that have ongoing action. They're continuous. Continuous action. And so Paul is saying this action of submitting is a continuous, ongoing action. But passive verbs mean that the subject or the object is being acted upon by the verb. See, later in the command to children and workers to obey, that's an active verb. They are to do something. They are to be actively doing something. But passive is not about doing something. It's about being made something. When Paul speaks here, he's not saying you are forced to do something for other people. No, he's saying that you are to make yourself available. You make yourself in a place where you can serve and submit to one another. Paul is speaking that the church would continually cause themselves to be in a position where they are serving one another. And he uses this word a number of times in his writings, exhorting the church to be willing to serve anyone in their fellowship. But why? I mean, why should we be voluntarily submitting and serving others? We read the verse 21. And submitting yourselves to one another in reverence of Christ. This isn't about you. It's not about you. It's not about others. It's about Christ. See, I am to voluntarily submit myself to others out of reverence, fear, and worship of Christ. Out of love of Christ. So you're ready now for me to tell you what's wrong with you? What our problem is? What my problem is? Selfishness. Pride. Conceit. Self-centeredness. C.S. Lewis calls this the great sin, the vice that leads to every other vice, the complete anti-God state of mind. Paul, telling us to submit to one another in reverence of Christ, helps us take that step where we remove ourselves as the center, the authority of our lives, and we revere Christ as our master, our king, our head, our savior. We submit to one another out of this new understanding. It's our selfishness that gets in the way of each one of these relationships. We have a tendency to put ourselves before others, to think of ourselves first of all. And that's what Paul is addressing in this passage. It's not about us. Paul shows that even all of these relationships, it's not about us and the other person. It's actually about Christ. Each one of these relationships signifies a relationship with Christ. Do you still sense the impossibility of this? I remember talking to a friend in college about humility. I said to him, I used to think I was a really humble person, and then I realized thinking I'm a really humble person isn't very humble. See, we can't make ourselves humble by trying to be more humble. No, because then we're just thinking about ourselves more. So how are we supposed to push back against our selfishness, our pride, against our sinful nature, and be able to freely, joyfully submit to one another? The good news is that we are not able to do this on our own. And that Paul doesn't speak of us achieving this on our own. Verse 21, this key verse that sets up our entire relationships section, also closes off the previous section. So last week, Pastor Jay spoke on putting on the new self, about being imitators of God, of not doing things the way the world says that they should be done, but changing our thinking and doing things according to God's design, God's thinking, God's way. And at the end of this section, in 5:17, Paul says this, "Do not get drunk with wine, but be filled with the Spirit." But be filled with the Spirit. This verb, an imperative, is a command. Paul is telling us and commanding us, be filled with the Spirit. And then following this, we find these 5 present participles, meaning continuous action. See, these verbs, they modify that first verb. So Paul says, be filled with the Spirit, and as a result, you're going to be doing these things regularly, continuously. Be filled with the Spirit, and as a result, you'll be speaking to one another in songs. You'll be singing and making melody. You'll always be giving thanks, and you'll be submitting yourselves to one another. Be filled with the Spirit as to continually be submitting yourselves to one another in reverence of Christ. Okay, so knowing now what we know, let's look at Paul's instruction to each of these groups again. What does he say to each of these groups? What does he say to us this morning? Wives, be filled with the Spirit, continually submitting yourself to one another in reverence of Christ. And specifically submit to and respect your husband as your service to the Lord. Husbands, be filled with the Spirit, continually submitting yourself to one another in reverence of Christ. And love and cherish your wife before yourself, using Christ's love for the church, his sacrifice for the church, as your example. Children, junior highs, senior highs, young adults, be filled with the Spirit, continually submitting yourself to one another in reverence of Christ, and obey and honor your parents in the Lord. Parents, be filled with the Spirit, continually submitting yourself to one another in reverence of Christ, and raise your kids in the ways of the Lord. Workers, be filled with the Spirit, continually submitting yourself to one another in reverence of Christ, and do your work well from your heart unto the Lord. Bosses, be filled with the Spirit, continually submitting yourself to one another in reverence of Christ, and do good by your workers, for Christ your Master in heaven sees all as equals. I'm going to invite the worship team to come back to the platform as we move to a time of response. See, church, it's not about us. It's not about you. It's about Christ. Each of these relationships signifies or shows what a relationship with Christ is like. Paul is telling us that how you treat these others in your life is a direct reflection of how you are revering and worshiping and loving Christ. Maybe this morning as I've talked, you've known that there's something specific you need to correct in your life, in the way you're living out your days. Maybe you're not treating your workers as being loved by God. You're abusing your power. And so this week, you need to make adjustments to your leadership. Maybe you're slacking off at work. You're not honoring God through all that you do. And you need to learn this week to respect your boss and to work hard from your heart as though you're working to Christ himself. Maybe you were too often angry with your children and too often create an environment that leads to more anger. And this week, you need to work out that issue in your life. Or maybe you're disobeying your parents and you need to this week apologize to them and take steps to honor them, show them honor this week. Maybe you are neglecting to love your wife because she hasn't been respecting you. You don't feel respected, and so you aren't showing her love. But this week, you need to take that initiative. You need to take that first step and show them love and to cherish them, nourish them this week. Maybe you aren't respectful of your husband because he hasn't shown you love, and this week, you need to take that step and that initiative to show him respect as a way of honoring the Lord. Maybe you think of yourself as more important and higher, more spiritual, more mature than those other around you sitting in the pews here at church. And this week, you need to take a step to honor and serve them. We don't make these changes because the other person has changed and done something to treat us differently. We make those changes because we come to see our relationship with Christ is exhibited in each of these other relationships. We come to see it's all about Christ. There's a universal call in this passage, apart from what the Lord may be convicting you of particularly. There's this call: be filled with the Spirit, continually submitting yourselves to one another in reverence of Christ. So the call this morning, church, is be filled with the Spirit. Be filled with the Spirit. Submit yourselves to one another. Serve one another in this church body. And in all things have reverence for Christ. Because it's all about Him. He's the center.